Good morning. Good morning. All right. Waking everybody up. So consistent with the theme of this celebration so far, which has really actually been very forward-looking in the future and future-facing, I'm going to talk to you not about stuff I've done in the past, but about a big picture, ongoing institution-building project that I'm at the very early stages of. But because it's a very long journey, I'm going to talk about some of the initial baby steps that we're starting here at UCSD and how that might play out. So I spend a lot of time thinking about work, employment relations, labor, and social insurance policies. And so as a result, I've been part of a bunch of conversations about the future of work, the future of labor, where are things going. And as a result, or part of those conversations, I become increasingly convinced that it's not clear that we really actually have a good handle on where things are going. So in particular, social insurance, those are the sets of rules and regulations and policies that we have in place that are basically designed to prevent people from falling into outright destitution simply due to a lost job or an injury or even through aging. And we can really credit, at least in the United States and most of the industrialized world, we can credit the greatest generation, the people that came up in the Depression and World War II, with the design, the development, the political fight, and the implementation of those policies. But as a result, the policies we have in place really embed and have as at their core a vision of a job and an employment contract that looks like something from the 1940s and the 1950s, and also of a household and neighborhoods. And this matters because how we count work, how we count jobs, has strong consequences for how well our social safety nets function, and who falls through, who doesn't, who gets what, and so forth. So let me give you a specific example. What it means to have a job or go to work is changing. We think it's changing. Workers are facing new risks that are accelerating in ways that we really don't have a good handle on. So this is one example. So I don't know if you're a gamer. I'm actually myself not. I have too much other stuff to do. But this is an example from a screenshot from the Twitch broadcast platform. And if you're familiar with this, actually one of the biggest users of bandwidth on the internet in the world. And what happens is people go online. The woman in the corner here is the broadcaster, and she, in real time, is streaming herself playing a massive online multiplayer video game. And all along the side there, you see people coming online, watching her play and interacting with her and others, and actually giving her money for the privilege of sitting there and watching her play this video game. And this is an income stream, and it can be quite successful for some people. And there's a variety of things that are cropping up around the world that have this feeling for it. So is this work? Should we count it as work? Does she have a skill? And these are questions that our current systems are not set up to answer or to tell us anything about. And in particular, this person does not have any protections for minimum wage. She spent a bunch of time and effort becoming really good at this one particular video game, or maybe two. What happens if that game is no longer popular and her income stream dries up? Or what happens if the economy goes into recession in general and people are no longer willing or able to send her money or as much money as she had before? What then? Is she going to fall through the cracks? And I'm here to tell you that we really actually don't have a good handle on this. We can't tell you how widespread this is, how fast it's growing. And as some of my colleagues around that you'll hear from later have done great work showing the geographic dispersion in opportunity and reward in our economy. We don't know where this is happening or growing. So in other words, I want to talk to you today about something that you might consider boring. It's infrastructure. And we know from an experience in Minneapolis a few years ago what happens if we fail to maintain and invest in our infrastructure. But I'm not going to talk to you about bridges and roads and dams, as critical as those might be. I'm going to talk to you about a different kind of infrastructure, and that is our public data, employment, federal statistical agencies measurement infrastructure. It's important. We need this widely accessible, reliable, and it's critical that it's public and verifiable, and we can all coordinate on the same sets of numbers and measurements over time. And this is an extraordinary service that we've built up in this country and around the world. And like many aspects of our infrastructure, it is potentially weakening. So we're facing the typical problems of disinvestment. So for example, the spending on federal statistical agencies in the United States right now is about 10% lower than it was on average between 2004 and 2013. But that's not just the challenge that I'm going to focus on here. The challenge is more fundamental. In particular, our tools for understanding work and employment are old and getting outdated. They rely on sending out surveys. They rely on calling people on phones that they just don't answer anymore. Knocking on doors, and people now have cameras on their doorbells and may not want to talk to you if they don't know who you are. And this old way is very top-down, it's observational, and there's lots of evidence that it's getting less reliable, more expensive, and the questions we're asking are not necessarily keeping up with the way we think the world might be changing. And if we don't figure out new ways of asking questions or eliciting data and information from people, we're not going to know what's going on, and we're going to make worse decisions as policymakers, as business people, and as citizens and workers. So let's take a step back then. What, if we could start rebuilding or changing or improving things, what would we like this new data infrastructure to be able to do or to have? Well, I'll give you a few ideas. One thing that we're getting used to now is we'd like it to be always on. That is to say, it's always collecting data from wherever it's appearing and being able to ingest it into an understandable format that we can then access later on, as opposed to being very episodic, idiosyncratic, and fixed in time. We want it to be bottom-up and participatory, as opposed to top-down and observational. It has to be secure, and we have to have the best security protocols and privacy protocols in place. And we want it to be flexible. We have so many new forms of data that we've heard about. We have images, movies, unstructured text. And that can be really powerful to extract information from. And we now have tools that allow us to do that. So we don't have to force people into ordered categories necessarily. And finally, we'd like to deliver it publicly in a way that allows other people, perhaps in the private sector, to build new things on top of it that might be specialized dissemination tools targeted at specific audiences or use cases for their particular problems or needs. So Tim O'Reilly, for example, has called this government as platform, and I think that's a nice image. So where would we get some examples on this? And I'm going to tell you that we actually have a model for how this works in place already, or at least an analogy that I'm going to make. And this is that weather station analogy that's in the title. So our weather station, weather data gathering infrastructure is already out there, and it has a bunch of these attributes that I've already just described to you. We have important top-down, observational, capital-intensive, government-owned and managed tools, satellites, networks of buoys, and things like that. But we also have ways of directly incorporating a whole variety of data sources that are or data points that are being provided around the world by private entities, individuals, people, and firms that are being fed directly into our data systems and calibrated with what we're already seeing and affects our ability to forecast and understand the weather and the climate. So in particular, I'm just going to give you one example. It's called the Citizen Weather Observer Program, and this is just an image from where we're sitting right now, the San Diego region. And each one of these dots is a house, a firm, sometimes it's a car or a boat that has telemetry on it and a weather variable measuring system, and it's feeding information into the weather system right now as we speak. So imagine if we could apply this analogy to our social data infrastructure. Suppose individual workers or households or firms could, on their own time or when it seems right, directly donate data into our system to help us understand what they're doing on the job, when and under what conditions. Imagine if we could push individual surveys at very granular moments in time and space to ask people short questions about what's going on, and they could be confident that their responses would be protected and not used against them. We could have small micro surveys, and we could ultimately, I'd like to imagine the ability to nowcast our economy, or at least our labor market, and the types of jobs and skills being used at very fine resolution in space and time. We could see new types of work and tasks and jobs emerging. Educational institutions, like where we're sitting, could adjust the timing of classes or the content much more quickly and rapidly to respond to the needs nearby. We could see people slipping through the cracks more rapidly. And that's the idea of the kind of socio-economic weather station that I'm trying to pitch for the future. And that's great, but it's obviously far more than I'm capable of delivering on my own, or even if I had infinite graduate students and postdocs. So how can we actually make some progress in this area and try to demonstrate there's some use here, and that maybe we can attract some interest and support from people in government, at other institutions, and so forth. And so what we're doing right now is, or what I'm doing right now, is trying to triangulate. That is to say, figure out where exactly are the holes in our existing data systems that we can show that we're missing. So to that end, with the generous support of the Yankelovich Center here at UCSD, I'm convening a meeting with a bunch of the journalists, the ethnographers, the social scientists who are doing the deep, longitudinal, qualitative interview work with Americans and people elsewhere, asking them, how are you earning a living? What is it you're doing? What are you facing? Who are your employers, and how do you understand your relationship with them? Finding out what they're saying in very deep detail over time, and then bringing them into a dialogue with data scientists and more quantitatively oriented social scientists to try to figure out ways that those two ways of understanding the world might be able to map together. And is there a way to build scalable tools that can have some of the benefits of these deep, unstructured, longitudinal interviews with the scale and speed of data science and data systems? So that's where we're going, and ideally that would then lead to some mini prototypes of a socioeconomic weather station, maybe something that you could experiment with in the next few years, and that's where I hope we can go to better understand the future of work and labor in this country and elsewhere.